Hello and welcome to part 2, where I will explain Hitler's German socialism. Today we will first talk about the idea of the Volksgemeinschaft. But before we come to that, I have to make a little disclaimer because my last video got taken down from YouTube because of the promotion of racism, even though I clearly stated that I just take quotes and that this was not my opinion, etc. However, here I say it is just educational purposes, this video. It is not my opinion, I do not promote racism or anything like that. Thank you, YouTube, I hope you don't take this video down. So, coming to the idea of Volksgemeinschaft, which is translated into English, people's community. What was that? Basically, it was the idea of a mass of people, of basically the German folk or the German people, all united under the race. So, as we talked before in the other video in part 1, for Hitler, the most important thing was basically to have no classes anymore, no class ideas, no class goals, but just race goals, so that everyone worked towards the goal of the race. But now I will let Hitler speak for himself. I quote, "National Socialism takes for itself the pure idea from each of these two camps. From the camp of the bourgeois tradition, it takes national resolve, and from the materialism of the Marxist dogma living, creative socialism, Volksgemeinschaft. That means a community of all productive labor. That means the oneness of all vital interest. That means overcoming bourgeois privatism and the unionized, mechanically organized masses." So what does that mean? Basically, Hitler meant with that National Socialism took the good parts of the two different ideologies of bourgeois and the socialists. From the bourgeois, they basically took the national pride, so the nationalism, which is a very important part of National Socialism and which differentiated it with normal kinds or other kinds of socialism, or what Hitler called Marxism. And on the other side, from socialism, they took the very kind of economical idea of socialism and the idea of kind of separating the people, the not one people, but different races. Another reason why National Socialism really remembers us actually to normal socialism is the symbolism. Because Hitler was quite a fan of the living of the land, for farmers, of peasants, of, let's put it that way, honest work. He really loved that, and he kind of admired the normal land workers because he himself saw himself as someone who earned money through hard, natural work. That's also why later in the socialist state, little children were sent during, for example, the summer vacation onto the countryside to work there, to be their laborers for example, on farms, etc. To get this, because he saw this really as like a German thing to do, like of the Aryan race, to live off the land, to work on the land. So it was important for him to teach children already to do that, especially city children, because with the city he was always like, this has more Jewish spirit in the city, while he was on the country, he believed that the country population had more an Aryan spirit. So while he saw the city people as more soft, more Jewish, he saw the country people as stronger and Aryan. That's why it was important for him to send the kids, when they had a school vacation, to the countryside to get harder, to get hardened, and to have more of an Aryan spirit, to learn how to have hard labor. However, back to the quote. "The hammer will once more become the symbol of the German worker, and the cycle the sign of the German peasant. And the intellect must form with them an indissoluble alliance, just as we have been preaching and propagating it for a decade and a half. So I found this quote also very important because here we can basically see how Hitler explains the symbols of the international Jewish Marxism, as he would call it, are basically also sickle and hammer for the peasant. I will quote: "When you regard the symbol of today's celebration, which a German artist created for us, then it should convey to you the following. Sickle and hammer were once the symbols of the German peasant and the German worker. The arrogance and lack of reason of a bourgeois age abandoned and lost these symbols. Ultimately, Jewish international literateurs stole the tool of hard-working people and nearly succeeded in exploiting them for their own designs and purposes." What is interesting here as well is that he basically blamed the bourgeois class to have basically a lack of reason, and thus the sickle and the hammer were not anymore basically the sign of the German workers and peasants, which it were before. And as I told you in the previous video, for him the bourgeois were basically influenced or controlled by the Jews. So for him that made sense. The Jews basically brought the bourgeois to basically abandon these signs for the workers and make the life for the workers hard, etc. So that the international Jews can now use the symbol for their purpose. Before, it was just for the German worker and the German peasant. It is unclear, however, here if he actually means that only for the German peasant and the German worker it were the symbols, or if it was also, for example, for the French worker, the French peasant. That is unclear because he emphasizes especially the German peasant and the German worker. So the international Jew stole the symbols from the German worker out of Hitler's side, and his German socialism is basically there to reconquer these symbols for the German worker, basically to fix this issue. Now, when Hitler actually came to power, there was still the class conflict for him, which was implemented by the Jews. So he had to overcome this class conflict first. Well, how did he do that? Well, he first looked at how did the Jews actually create this class conflict. First, it was the influence on the bourgeois through, for example, newspaper, through money, etc. That was hard to solve, the newspapers, etc. He could nationalize and thus take control over them. But then there was still the workers, which were unhappy basically with the bourgeois because of bad working conditions, etc. So he thought, well, who controls the workers, or where did they get the influence from that they should attack the bourgeois? And this was from the trade unions, because he said basically the Jews owned the trade unions and controlled them, and kind of wanted to create like an class war and civil war in Germany, basically between the class workers and the bourgeois. So what did he do? He dissolved the trade unions and created a national trade union, which is basically the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or German Labor Front, DAF. Because now he basically managed that workers and factory owners, etc., were all part of the German Labor Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront. So basically, this nationalized trade union, which is basically a trade union for the whole of Germany, had no power over the workers and over the factory owners and the management, etc. So this was his goal, because with that, he thought he eliminated the class war. because there was no trade union anymore that was against the factory owners, etc. And there was no factory owner anymore who could do anything against the workers, which was not wanted by the state. So it was basically, for him, the class war was over because there was no two fronts anymore, but all were united under one German labor front. And well, who controlled the German labor front? Obviously, well, officially, it was not really controlled by the party, but it really was. If we look at it, the party had the power, and the German Labor Front had strong ties to the party. So if Hitler said, yeah, I want that to happen to the workers, I want that to happen to the factory owners, he could just do it. And the German Labor Front basically had the full power. Like if they said to a factory owner, oh, you have to build a sporting place for your workers. It is not, this was actually a real case where the workers didn't even want that sporting place, but the German Labor Front said, yeah, you build that. And the factory owner said, like, no, they don't even need that. They are tired from work. They don't want to do sports after work or during the breaks, etc. But the German Labor Front said, yes, you do it, or you have to give up your factory. And then he had to build it. That was basically how the German Labor Front worked. The factory owner had no chance against it because it was so strong aligned to the party. The German worker had also no chance against it. If there was something, for example, cutting wages or stuff like that, they couldn't do anything because basically normally the trade unions, which were dissolved, would fight for them, right? But now they are dissolved. So now they would go to the German Labor Front, but the German Labor Front would say, no, wages are cut, you have no chance, we decide that. So you see there, it is all subordinated to the interest of the state. While before there was, for example, it was possible to have a class war, because the factory owner fights against the workers. Now this is absolutely impossible because all had to follow the state's interest, and no one was able to fight against the state's interest because that would basically be just, yeah, you get into prison, you have no chance against that. For example, Junkers. The state, Hitler, wanted Junkers to produce the Stuka, well, which is the diving bomber, the famous diving bomber of the Germans in the Second World War. Before, though, they only produced transport planes. The most famous one, Tante U-52, which is a very heavy transport plane, which is also very famous. And actually, the German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, used it also. But the factory owner, or basically the owner of Junkers, said, like, no, I don't want to build Sturzkampfbomber, close air support. No, I don't want that, diving bombers. And Hitler said, yes, you will. And he said, no. So what happened basically? They forced him to sell the company. Yes, he got money for it, so it didn't just get taken away from him, but he had to give it up. And he had no chance because the state could do whatever the state wanted to do. So this was also Hitler's idea of the state having the control. There was not even a class war possible because no one had more power than the state, than the Deutsche Arbeitsfront. It had all power over the workers and over the factory owners. Another German factory owner said at that time, basically, he had to be more politician than actually businessman because he had to all the time try to make the state happy, make the officials happy, because if he did that, he had kind of an advantage towards his opponents or concurrents, etc. But that was only later during the war, where the German economy got even more strict than it was at the start of Hitler's, basically, governance time. However, This I will talk about in another video because there I can really get into depth and give you all the sources and the quotes that are important to prove my point actually, and not just say anything, because we always want to prove. So yes, Hitler's German socialism was very socialist in its character. It was the collective over the individual. Basically, the German term Gemeinnutz for Eigennutz. So first look at the collective and then look at you. The individual was always second class. The state, the collective, the people, the race was first class. And everyone should follow that because, as I said in the first video, everyone who didn't follow that had kind of, for Hitler, Jewish traits. Because he said Jew was always in self-interest, acted always in self-interest, was egoistical, never looked basically for the survival of their own race. They just wanted money, they were greedy, etc. Where the Aryan looked at the people first, at his race, wanted to make the race have a good time, go well, and then looked at herself. Because the Aryan said, if my people are well, then I am well. While the Jew basically said, out of Hitler's perspective, if I'm well, that's all I need. Basically, like that. So that's also why he connected capitalism with the Jews very, very strongly, and why he hated capitalism, because that was the ground idea of capitalism was for him Jewish thinking, which, yeah, it is how he saw it basically. Oh, yes, and just to point it out, I always try in my videos, or if I write at my book, I always try to make no moral judgment over what Hitler did or what the others did. I think everyone should do their own moral judgment. Because in the end, it is very, very, I mean, for me personally, it is bad what he did, obviously. But still, I always try to be neutral because I often see historians doing that, saying, for example, oh yeah, he was a madman, he was crazy, completely a fuck, completely out of his mind. He was horrible, everything he did was very bad. He did that, that was shit. He did that, that was racist. He did that, that was bad. They are very, very, very biased towards him, or at least they point always out that everything he did was horrible. Which, sure, you can be of that opinion, and I don't say this opinion is wrong or anything. But I think to do real academical work, and that contains kind of a neutrality. You should be neutral for your topic, because this is really important. I don't think that they say the same things. For example, if they speak about Churchill, was everything he said bad or what? Yeah, I think it is too personal if you say, oh yes, he did that, that was horrible, he did that, that was horrible. Because basically humans always act rational. And because all humans have kind of the same logic, they always act rational. Even if I see, for example, Hitler killed the Jews, did the Holocaust, right? For me personally, that is bad, it makes no sense. But I still would not say he did act non-rational, irrational, because out of his perspective, out of his experience, out of his worldview, his actions were very rational. They made a lot of sense. They were right. He thought he saved the world with that. So I can only say, or better, to formulate it better, in order to say that his act was irrational, I would have to put my opinion onto that. I would just give you my opinion about what he did was irrational or rational. And that's not really academical, because your personal opinion should not be in your work. It should be research. It should be kind of neutral. So it is a mistake to just say to everything what he did makes no sense, was irrational, etc. Yeah, you can be analytical and can point out what was a mistake in his beliefs and why he came to that beliefs through these mistakes, etc. But you should not say that everything was irrational, etc. That you can say, however, if you give your own opinion over it. So if you say, yeah, I will give you my opinion about Hitler, then you can say, yeah, that was horrible, that was wrong, that was very stupid, etc. Then you can say absolutely. But I think within academia, you should have kind of a strict neutrality for its topic, even though it's hard, especially when it comes to a horrible topic like that, like the Holocaust. It is very, very hard. But I prefer, and obviously it is in the end uh, to everyone different, but I prefer to have a strict neutrality for the topic and give you, the viewers, basically my research towards it and my conclusions. And you have to basically put your own morality towards it. You can decide your own if it's good that he nationalized the trade unions. You can have the opinion that this was a great thing or so. I don't judge about that. You can say it's a horrible thing. You can say socialism is good. You can say socialism is bad. And yeah, if you say that, that's no problem to me. But I here want to be strictly neutral, to just give you the facts, give you basically my research, the quotes I found, etc. So you can build your own opinion over it. So in the end, yeah, I have my very own opinion over the things, but I try to keep it out of my analysis because I think it would be kind of misleading and it would bias viewers if I just give straight up my opinion all the time over the things. So that is just my approach. If you have a different approach, for example, if you're a YouTuber and you say, yeah, but it's important because you have to point out how horrible it was, that's fine to me. It's no problem. I just say that out of my opinion, it is wrong to do that because it biases people into one direction. And that's not what I want. I want the viewers to think on their own and judge on their own what they think about the different actions. Because we can't say that everything that Hitler did was bad. But what we obviously should also not say that much what he did was good. So that is just it, at least out of my opinion. So let's go on with the video and come back to topic. So let's go on directly with the quote. It is thus necessary that the individual should finally come to realize that his own ego is of no importance in comparison with the existence of the nation, that the position of the individual is conditioned solely by the interests of the nation as a whole. So this once more plays into the idea for Hitler that the personal interest is of no importance. The real importance is of the whole race, of the whole people, the interest. Because people can have many different interests, right? Some people have the interest more in business, some people want to earn money, some people want to help people, etc. But what really matters for Hitler is the interest of the whole people. And everyone should work towards that goal, even if you dislike, for example, the work you get. You have to now work in that factory because it basically serves the interest of the people. Then you have to do it. You have to pay higher taxes because it's the interest of the people. Then you have to do it. That is basically the idea. The individual should not be able to decide much. It should be the decision of the state. Or basically here, because we have the Führerprinzip, the idea that Hitler himself decides what is needed for the people, what should the people do, what is the goal of the people, what do the people need to in order to survive. Because basically he says that democracy can't do that, because it has too much influence from other people, it is too complicated, it is slow in decision taking, etc. He said only one guy can decide that, and this is the Führer. The Führer, he himself has the decision over the whole people, because he says all people support him because he's one of them. He's one of the people. He's not a politician. He's not a bourgeois. He's not a rich guy. He lived on the streets of Munich and Vienna. He was poor. And he said he worked his whole way towards the goal to serve his people. And he said he got there. He got elected as chancellor, and then he was the Führer. The Führer of the people. Thus, he said basically that he was able to know what is right for the people and what wrong, and everyone has to serve their part towards the goal of the people, which was for him very necessary. Because he said if everyone just serves their own goals, the people come second, and thus the people will basically get destroyed, especially in those times, because he said it was where the times of decision, where the Jews were so strong and everywhere and tried to also destroy Germany, basically. They infiltrated Germany, they infiltrated Britain, the US, France, and took already control over the Soviet Union. So he was like, yeah, we are in the final, basically the final fight of the Aryan race against the Jewish people, which is quite crazy if you think about it. Because he basically said if they lose that final fight, if they lose this war, then the world will end and the complete civilization of the world will collapse. Well, it did not really, but anyway, it was still very, 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 the thought was that this was the final decision. So he couldn't allow people to just do what they wanted. He needed all people behind him in order to reach the goals of defeating the international Jews, and so that the Aryan race could live on without getting endangered by the Jews or basically influenced from the Jews. So here we have the next quote. The state must have the power to mold the life of the nation in all its aspects. We will not tolerate any organizations or ideas that stand in opposition to the unity of the German people. This is basically also a quote explaining why he dissolved the trade unions, because they were, out of his perspective, very much against the unity of the German people. Because the German people didn't need that class war, and he exactly wanted to destroy that class war in favor of racial unity. So here we see again, it was for him very important that no organization was left in Germany that was against the unity of the whole German people, and basically that was in favor of class distinction, etc. Well, let's go directly to the next quote. The good of the community takes priority over that of the individual. That is what I already spoke about. Let's go on. But the state should retain control. Every owner should feel himself to be an agent of the state. It is his duty not to misuse his possessions to the detriment of the state or the interests of his fellow countrymen. So what does Hitler speak about here? He basically favors here the idea that everyone is an agent of the state. So what you own is, yes, it's your possession, but it's not really yours, because in the end it's the state's. So you should basically act in favor of the state, because if you don't, the state can just take it away from you, which is actually true, since the Reichswehrboy, sorry, since the Reichstagsfeuer, and basically the Notverordnung, which is like an emergency law, it was possible for the state to take everything the people owned into its possession. Like there was no individual right anymore over the ownership. Like nothing protected you from it, that the state just could take your home away, could take your factory away, etc. So this is really, it was 1932 where he said that now, but it basically already emphasized the idea he would implement later. So that the state could take away everything from everyone, especially from the Jews. That was also why it was so easy for the state just to take the gold from the Jews, to take their jewelry, to take their art, to take their houses, etc. It was all within the law because they created a new law that made all of this possible. Same was for example, the German communists, or for example, for monarchists, etc. All people he did not like, he could just take away everything from them without really breaking the law, since they implemented a new law that made that actually possible. And this law was really important because it really changed the way how the whole economy could work. And also in the war, later in the war, it made things a lot easier than actually in a democracy. So this really reveals the socialist economies underlying the Nazi ideology. It's like private property could still exist, but only basically as a trust held for the racial community. Individual ownership was subordinated to collective racial interests. So the racial group was again the most important one, and all individual interest was subordinated to the state's interests. That's why the state could take everything away from you if you acted against the state's interest. That directly leads us into our next aspect, and this is the Gleichschaltung, often translated into synchronization or coordination, which basically was the idea that everything within the state had to serve the state. So everything had to be synchronized or coordinated towards the goal of the state. So you as individual, as we spoke before, had to work towards the state to help the state reach the goal, which were then again the goal of the people. For Hitler, this was also a socialist idea because it could also go into the economy. So all economy had to work towards the goals of the state, and the goals of the state would determine the whole economy. Thus, it was basically a state-controlled economy, but obviously not a state-owned economy. It was still privatized. So private people could own factories, but only if they did what the state wanted. And this is really the thing. Basically, the state had the control because that was also what Hitler thought. It was way easier to just have private people in there in the factories that had the factories but had to do what the state said, than to actually take control over these factories, because then you have to put people in there, then you have to align the goals, then you have to plan everything, etc. That was way more expensive because they needed basically managers in that companies, and it was also basically more complicated. So his idea was, yeah, we don't need to own the factories, we just control them. For it's the idea that they have to work for us. And this made it on the paper a capitalist economy where you see it had private control, private ownership. But on the other hand, if you look really deep into it, you see that the state controls these private people. So it was like, was that really capitalist? So here we have again a quite interesting quote from Hitler. I will quote: "The most important thing is the inner conversion of the people, their national comrades, the nation, and that is a political task. Almost all of the people are still caught up in liberalistic viewpoint. Do you really believe that a dyed-in-the-wool industrialist will suddenly be prepared to admit that his ownership is not a right but an obligation? That capital shall no longer rule but be ruled? That the life of the individual does not matter but rather that of the total? So here he spoke really about the Gleichschaltung, the conversion of the people from a liberalistic viewpoint to a National Socialist viewpoint. So what was here really important is basically that capital should no longer rule. So people should not do things to gain money. Basically, that should not be the goal anymore. The businessman should not conduct a business only because it's profitable, even though it is, for example, against the people's interest, because it is too high prices he wants, etc. It should be the other way around. He should basically rule the capital. So the people should rule the capital. They basically make, for example, cheap prices and they get money for it, yes. But they are not ruled anymore by the capital. That is very, very, very important, also in the sense of basically implementing the goals of the people over the individual interest. So it is basically all goes into the same point. The individual does not matter. You should not be ruled as individual by capital. No, you should rule capital. So the people should rule capital and not act as self-interest. I want the most money. No, they should act out of people interest. We can trade with money, yes, but we should always act in the people's interest. So this really reveals Hitler's generally belief that he was implementing a revolutionary socialist transformation, just one based on race rather than class. He was explicitly calling for the capital to be ruled rather than ruling, and for individual interests to be subordinated to the collective. So this was what we talked about now. So I will point out now some points this basically worked through. So the first point was basically dismantling independent institutions and replacing them with national controlled organizations. Second point, indoctrinating youth through the Hitler Youth, create what he called the German spirit. So the Hitler Youth was essential to give the youth that German spirit, give them Aryan traits and let them think like Aryan people. So the youth was a main point for him in order to safeguard Germany's or the whole Aryan race's future. Third point, controlling culture and media to eliminate degenerate influences. Yeah, influences basically by the Jews, etc., that would damage German interests, that would damage Aryan interest. So this was also very essential. Fourth point, subordinating business to state direction through price controls and production quotas. This was also a thing. He basically said, yeah, for example, that good can only cost that maximum, which is a very socialist economy policy and is very against business interests. That you say, yeah, maximum that for that. It was actually very critical if you charged more. However, there was still then like an black market where people basically bought things for more than the official maximum price was, because were shortages due to that, because many companies were not profitable anymore because their products were not allowed to be expensive enough, let's put it that way, expensive enough to be actually for the business to be profitable. This was very hard for many businesses. So we see there the problem. And then he said, you have to produce that much or it is very bad for you, or you will lose your business if you don't. So we see that here. And then we speak about the fifth point, forcing businesses to collectivize into larger concerns that could be better controlled. Exactly. Like, I don't remember exactly how many Konzerne there were, which is basically were syndicates, something similar like syndicates. I don't remember exactly how many there were, but most businesses were collectivized into them. So that's the syndicate or the Konzern, the Großkonzern, was easy to be controlled, and this concern could control the smaller businesses. So the state only had to give the direction to the concern. Now you have to do that, and the concern's mission was it to give those interests, those points the businesses had to follow to every single business. So this was easier for the state than to directly contact every business. So it was an hierarchical, basically, and collectivized hierarchical structure for easier economical control. However, Hitler knew that this transformation couldn't happen naturally, away from this liberalistic point of view to an basically a collective point of view for the race, because he basically said the Jews already influenced the people during the Weimar period so much that they had this thinking very deep in them. So it was now the state's, basically the state's focus, the state's goal to force the people to a collective mindset, which was very important for him because he said basically without that, the state would have lost already and the Jew would have won. So it was essential to force the people into that right Aryan mindset. So Hitler's German socialism wasn't just cultural or political. It had profound economic implications, and he really disliked what he saw as basically the capitalist class, which he was said they would exploit the workers. And he saw them also as corrupted and basically that they had Jewish influence over them, which made them how they were. He said before they were not like this, but the Jew made them like this and made basically through that the worker suffered. So coming directly to the next quote. For it is appealing that the common man who has to bear the burden in order to return the capital sees that, despite his hard work, diligence, thrift, and in spite of real work, he's hardly able to nourish himself and still less to dress. While this international capital devours billions just in interest, which he also must supply, and at the same time a whole racial stratum which does no other work than collect interest and cut coupons, spreads in the state. That is basically what he said about the Jews. He said the worker had to work so hard, etc., in order to barely survive, and that not really well. While the Jew just took his loan interest, basically, because he connected Jews always to giving loans out, which many people at that time did and before, because it was a common job for the Jews to loan money out. He basically said the Jew was just basically lazy at his home and took the interests from the people, so he got rich, while the workers had to work so hard and still suffered. So this is really his picture, that this was really the self-interest of the Jew. The Jew is lazy, he doesn't have to work because he's a capitalist who just takes the money out of the worker. While the worker is the Aryan who has to suffer, who has to work and barely survives. And this is also from his speech, Why We Are Anti-Semites. So there he actually explains why they were anti-Semites, which is a very interesting speech. I recommend everyone to listen to it in order to understand fully why Hitler was actually an anti-Semite. So Hitler saw this as injustice, which basically his version German socialism would correct. He believed that real socialism, which he had, the German socialism, required national control of capital and was against every international free market. Because these international free markets were, out of his view, controlled by the Jews. So he had to fight against them with national capital, which was controlled by the German people. So yes, the Hitler's economic system involved extensive state control over production, pricing, distribution. Business were forced to follow state directives about what to produce, at what quantities, and at what prices. This was enforced through Preiskommissare, which were basically price commissionaries. They decided the prices, they set the prices according to the state policy rather than to the free market, where every businessman would basically set their own prices. So yeah, the Volksgemeinschaft was very, very, very essential for his worldview and also to overcome economic conflict in his view. So as next I will quote him from a speech he gave at the Winterhilfswerk in Berlin in 1934, which is very interesting because the Winterhilfswerk basically helps poor people that don't have enough money for food with some food, etc. This is very already also kind of a socialist policy. I quote, "In Germany, we have overcome all of that, yet not because a few economists put their factories back in operation, but because the Volksgemeinschaft, created by National Socialism, abolished this political and economic madness, thus securing orders for the factories and an income for workers and entrepreneurs." So you see what he actually thought about the Volksgemeinschaft and his policies just 1 year after he got elected. He already was like, yeah, we overcame all of these problems just through simple politics. And this made the people believe more into him because the state was quite pumping money out to the people, which quite created a deficit, but at that point it was still bearable. Also, obviously, looking into the armaments industry, how they put money out there is also crazy. But at that point, it was not even visible. Later, it became a problem, but at that point, not. So people were quite happy with it because he fought against basically people having no job. Many people got actually jobs through him, through state programs, which is obviously not really visible, basically an indicator for a healthy economy, but rather exactly for a socialist economy where the state gives the people work in order for them to be not jobless anymore. Women had or were encouraged to give up their jobs in order for men to take it. So this all made basically people less suffering for jobs, searching for jobs because more jobs were available and people could actually get jobs, which was very good for the economy and also kind of very good for him because he could show, hey, not so many people are jobless anymore, and this is because of me. So this worked actually out quite well for him at the start, even though it was obviously through enormous state spending, which, as I already said, will hunt Hitler later again. But about that I will do another video. So in the end, we can say that Hitler's policies were kind of at the start. They actually boosted especially the poor workers, etc. at the start, so it quite worked. But yes, this was basically the little overview, the part 2 of the video, over basically Hitler's ideology. I hope you could learn something from that video. I hope you liked the video. I'm still very new to YouTube, so there are many points where I can improve and get better, but I will work on that. But yeah, if you have any wish about what I can do a video about, write it down in the comments. I will look at the comments and I will answer every comment, obviously, or like every comment. Read it, of course. But yeah, that is basically just a short overview. I will dig way deeper in the future into the certain aspects of Hitler's ideology and also on other aspects, more on economy, etc. Because this was just a very short overview and I gave you just very general quotes about that. For further proof, we need further quotes, which is very important in that. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. If you disagree with me, write it down in the comments. If you agree with me, great. But yeah, I wish you a great day and bye for now.